Manohar and Dr. B.J. Rajesh from Yashoda Hospital, Secunderabad. So, just to give introduction of Dr. Nitin, most of I think I1M users in the country might already know Dr. Nitin Manohar. Dr. Nitin has a DM in neuroanesthesia from NIMHANS, Bangalore. He is also the program director for neuroanesthesia fellowships at Yashoda Hospitals. He has more than 50 publications in index journals, and his area of interest are I1M, AVIC craniotomy, and others. So welcome, sir. Welcome to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
I think Dr. Rajesh will be joining us in a moment. But before I, give it to Dr. Nitin, apart from the high quality monitoring work they do in their hospital, I think both Dr. Rajesh and Dr. Nitin have been passionately involved in teaching and training I1M in the country. So having been involved with them for a couple of years now, I think I can say they are the biggest influences and enablers of I1M in the country. I think Dr. Nitin will agree to that. So with this introduction, I'll hand over to Dr. Nitin to take us through the talk. So he will take you through all the modalities. Then we'll have a pause and maybe take questions, and then Dr. Rajesh will join us. Thanks, sir. Over to you.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear. Yes.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes. You might want to, full screen it.
Okay. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Chaitanya, for that flattering introduction. In between this COVID era and this gloomy circumstance, there is an opportunity for us to learn also and to share information. I thought, so when this opportunity came up, I said yes to it so that, we can share knowledge, and that's the only way I think we can learn from each other. And I'm here to share our experience and what we do at our center. And I hope this is useful to all the listeners. It's mainly directed towards the neurosurgeons, but also the neuroanesthetists and the people who are doing I1M also can be involved. So let's start the workshop. So the workshop it's a 2-hour program that we have divided into 3 parts. So I'll be initially talking on the modalities and introducing you to all the modalities. And then Dr. Rajesh will come. He's our senior consultant neurosurgeon. So he will be talking about the neurosurgical perspectives. And then we also have some, the equipment and the connections, how do you make it, and some exercises for you also, some cases to be discussed, and, troubleshooting and so on. So I hope you all like it. So let's start off. Chaitanya, can you see my screen?
Yes, sir. We can. Yes.
Yeah. So I bring you greetings from Yashoda Hospitals, Hyderabad, where we work. And so the intraoperative neuromonitoring, the first principle of intraoperative neuromonitoring is the same Hippocratic oath that we all took, when we took our medical degrees and we told that we will first do no harm. So the whole intraoperative neuromonitoring is based on this principle of Hippocratic oath. So we want to continue doing surgeries, high quality surgeries, but not to give deficits to the patient and to not do harm to the neurological structures involved. So this is Professor Penfield. He was the pioneer for intraoperative neuromonitoring. You can call him as the father of intraoperative neuromonitoring. So he used to work in Montreal, and you can see how early he started his work. Early in the 1900s, he used to stimulate the brain and evoke responses. So to give you a brief introduction, intraoperative neuromonitoring is like what I told you, to monitor the integrity of nervous structures and to various kinds of injuries that can happen during surgery. And our aim is to conduct a deficitless surgery as well as to do a maximal safe resection. So in maximal safe resection, it means you want to maximally remove tumors, but to not harm the nervous structures and to not give any kind of deficits to the patient. So that is our aim. So to understand intraoperative neuromonitoring, you have to understand some amount of physics and some amount of physiology as well. So I think physics we all have kind of forgotten when we took up medicine, and then our physics knowledge has been weak. But intraoperative neuromonitoring and the technology has come up, and it's important to understand the physics as well.
Okay.
So the objective.
Boarding with the parody on
Can you mute everyone, Chaitanya? I think some background noise is there.
Just a minute. Yes.
Okay. So the main objective of intraoperative monitoring is to prevent permanent injury. So the injuries can be of various types. So it could be mechanical when you're operating, when you're doing a surgery, the surgeon can apply a retractor. It can also cause, direct harm to the nervous tissues. It could be vascular, when you're operating around blood vessels and they go into vasospasm, or they can have ischemic influence on the brain. It could be positional. So suppose you're doing a lateral position surgery for a long time, like a CP angle surgery. So the brachial plexus can be injured, and this is one of the main, complications of doing a lateral position surgery for a long time. So you can monitor the brachial plexus integrity in this kind of surgeries. And also it could be physiological, just like when you're doing aneurysm surgeries, when you probably when you when you allow hypotension to happen, that also harms the brain. So the injuries can be of multifold. So our aim of conducting or doing intraoperative neuromonitoring is that there is still available time so that we can intervene and we can prevent a permanent injury. So even though the evoked potential recordings have changed and the signals have dropped, but still there is time for us to intervene so that we can prevent the permanent injury. So it's something like ischemia and infarction. So you don't allow the ischemia to go in for an infarction. You can intervene during the ischemic phase and then you can get the good results. So there are various surgeries that can be performed with intraoperative monitoring. The list goes on and on. Any surgery which involves nervous tissue, or which involves functional tracts around the surgical part, can be monitored. But these are probably the neurosurgeries where the maximum benefit of intraoperative neuromonitoring has been seen, and there is very good evidence, like level 1 evidence now, to say that it has become kind of mandatory to use intraoperative neuromonitoring. So probably some of these are like spinal dystrophisms when you do pediatric tethered cords, myelocele, when you operate on brainstem lesions, CP angle lesions to prevent seventh nerve injury, tumors around the eloquent cortex for motor and for speech lesions, insular gliomas, also the spine tumors like intramedullary tumors. So there is very good evidence that you should use intraoperative neuromonitoring, and also deformity surgeries like kyphoscoliosis. So for neurosurgeons, there are various phases where neurosurgeons can use intraoperative monitoring. The senior most people probably would have learned their neurosurgery without having the benefit of having intraoperative neuromonitoring to stand by them on their back. But the senior most people also do use it for the most complicated cases when they have the benefit of intraoperative monitoring. The medium range neurosurgeons in their career use it as a reinforcement. So when you're doing a complex surgery, a reassuring feedback from the neurophysiologist or the team doing the neuromonitoring, like everything is going on well, that gives a very reassuring feeling for the surgeon to go ahead. And the junior most people, I think, are the most benefited, because you don't have to create deficits and learn your neurosurgery now. You have intraoperative neuromonitoring, so it's you can use it for various things, like how much retraction to apply on the brain, how to handle smoothly, how to handle the brain structures. So the intraoperative neuromonitoring signals can right away tell you that you're probably not doing it the right way. So there is usage for intraoperative neuromonitoring for all neurosurgeons in whatever phase of their career they are in. So this is the IONM availability across India that we studied 2 years back. This data is from 2 years back, and you can see that it is mostly the IONM centers were revolving around the metro cities, and but you can also see that there is in the south and in the north there is also penetration into the district level, and most of the centers are now coming up with. This was 2 years back, mind you, and now if you look at this one, probably we are going to collect the data now. You'll be amazed to see that it has penetrated throughout the country, and into small places and districts also. Neurosurgeons have started using intraoperative neuromonitoring. So the question is now, who should do neuromonitoring? So this is a question that we are faced as a country, because we don't have the optimal facilities of having neurophysiologists. So they are the best people who can do neuromonitoring, no doubt about it. But there is a scarcity of neurophysiologists in the country who are doing clinical neuromonitoring. So many centers have neurophysiologists, but most of the centers are managing without them. Neuroanesthesiologists, because they understand the physiology and the neurophysiology and the neuropathology, what is happening, and they are also present throughout the surgery with the neurosurgeon. And there is a lot of sync that has to happen between the anesthetist, physiologist, and the surgeon. So the neurophysiologist or neuroanesthetist also can play a major role, and many centers are the neuroanesthetists are taking up intraoperative neuromonitoring. Neurosurgeons are the apex of this thing. They will ask for neuromonitoring, but for them to do neuromonitoring themselves is going to be a huge task because you're involved in a complex surgery. You cannot look at the screen, you cannot look at signals. You can do some amount of basic modalities. There are something called as surgeon directed models where you can itself do some amount of monitoring, but to have a good monitoring team, I probably think you should have someone behind the screen and looking at the waveforms continuously. Technicians, yes. So in our country, there are a lot of technicians who are taking up neuromonitoring. So the EEG technicians, they are coming into the intraoperative neuromonitoring, and we ourselves have been involved in training these technicians. So we have IONM school that runs every twice a year, and then we have continuously trying to train these technicians into the intraoperative neuromonitoring so that they can help us out during the surgeries and setting up this monitoring and to take up this. Industry also, there is enough technical support, but somewhere we also have to be, we have to take it up, and we have to create our own team so that the industry they cannot support us for the whole time. So in what cases should we do intraoperative neuromonitoring? So in all cases probably this is an overkill, but considering the cost and all that, so but the advantage of doing in all cases is that you'll understand when when a signal goes wrong. In a normal case, it's better to learn in a normal case as to get a waveform, to get a normal waveform, than in a surgery which is critical. So this is one argument that people have, that you should probably start doing in all cases. In some centers they use it in only high risk cases where there is a risk of neurodeficits. We also have fallen into this category. We don't use for neuromonitoring for all cases. We discuss and we probably prioritize and use it for only the cases where high risk of neurodeficits is present. In the West, to get away from the medical legal issues, I think the West has gone in a way that every neurosurgery or every surgery where neurological structures are involved, they do neuromonitoring for medical legal issues. I don't think we will be getting there into this phase. That's a question that needs to be answered. So at the end of this workshop, I think my aim for this workshop would be to tell you what is neuromonitoring, what are the neuromonitoring modalities available, why we do it, when we do it, for which surgery, what monitoring modalities to apply, and then probably little amount of how we do it. I'm not going to go too much into technical stuff. I'm just going to give you the overall, the structure of what a waveform looks like, what are the abnormal waveforms, and so on. So this is the aim of the workshop. So many of you, whenever you would have seen neuromonitoring going on in any surgery, so you would enter the surgery and then you would feel a lot of wires around the theater, and you would feel you're somewhere and you're stuck and you get confused and you get demotivated. So my job is to make it simple for you, to make the concept clear for you so that you can you can use monitoring. It's not that difficult. So if you understand the concept, it's not that much difficult. So I'll try to make it as simple as possible for you. So coming into the evoke potential. So evoke potential means, so it basically means you are evoking a response. So you stimulate one part of the brain or any neural structure, and then you record a response at a distal structure, and then you monitor for the signal to transmit from the site of stimulation to the site of recording. You look at the time taken to evoke a response, and then you look at the response evoked also. So how much big the amplitude is. So these are the things that we look at. So evoke potentials have a lot of challenges in intraoperative monitoring because they are very minute. So if you consider ECG as probably 1,000 and EEG as possibly 100, evoke potentials are actually only one. So it's 1,000 the time of a ECG, and so it's very minute. So you need some amplification. There are other various principles that are applied during evoke potential monitoring. One of them is filtering. So you need to filter out the noise, the electrical noise that is present in the theater during so you need to filter it out, and then you need to average the signal, amplification, noise reduction by referencing, and then also subtracting it from the ground. So these are all the general principles evolved in all evoke potential monitoring. So this is something that you should understand. These are some of the basic terminologies that you need to understand, which will keep coming through the lecture and through whenever you understand neuromonitoring. You should know some basic terminologies. I'll try to make it simple for you. So when you start simulating, can you see my arrow? I think the arrow has been seen. So when you stimulate a response, you stimulate a structure of the brain, and then you evoke a response like this. So the time taken for the response to get evoked. Okay, so this is called as latency, or how late the response is coming. Okay, and then you look at the response. So how big is the response? So this is the amplitude from the topmost or the peak of the hill to the deepmost part of the valley. Okay, so that is your amplitude. So what we are doing throughout our intraoperative neuromonitoring is basically looking at these two things: latency increase or amplitude decrease. This is what worries us. So whenever the amplitude decreases or the evoked response, how they become smaller, or they take more time to evoke a response, that is the latency increases. So these are the main things that we look at. So this is a normal upper limb SSEP probably, and you can see that this one box is 5 milliseconds. So you can see 5, 10, 15, 20. So this is probably a N20 response. So that's how you label the evoke response. So this is a SSEP of the upper limb. N20 means N is negative, 20 is millisecond after which the response is evoked. So this is a N20 response. Similarly, for lower limb, if you do a lower limb posterior, tibial nerve SSEP, you can evoke a P40 response. That means P is positive, 40 is 40 milliseconds after which the response is evoked. So that's how it's labeled. So it is simple. Then other basic terminologies that you need to understand is, one is baseline. So what you mean by baseline is, so you take a response or evoke a response at the starting of surgery when there is a steady state of anesthesia going on, and then you see how the amplitudes and latencies are for the waveform, and then keep it as your baseline. And then you continue to do your surgery, and you identify critical step of surgery when you think you can do harm to the nervous structures, and then you continuously evoke the response then and compare those waveforms with the baseline. So basically acquire a baseline and then compare the evoke responses later with the baseline. And what do you see? Again, it's the same. It's the amplitude and latency. So any increase in latency or any decrease in amplitude. So that is what we look at. Next is alarm criteria. So you should have set alarm criteria for each case and each different situation. So there are various alarm criteria. I mean, the universal alarm criteria, what is said is a 50% decrease in amplitude and a 10% increase in latency. Okay, so this is a universal alarm that is set, but this does not hold true for all cases and like all neuromonitoring modalities. Like I'll tell you in this in the future slides that this can't be held true for all the cases. Okay, so in each case you have to prioritize and you have to assess it differently. So the alarm criteria are different in different situations. The third thing that you need to understand is a control. So it's always good to have a control. So in control, what do you mean is you record evoke responses from an area where the injury is not likely to happen also. So suppose if you are doing a lumbar case or a thoracic surgery case, thoracic spine case, so you are worried about your lower limb motor paraplegia or something. So what you do is you keep a control in the upper limb as well. So if you have a drop in all the signals, including the upper limb, which is the control, upper limb is the control here. So that means that there is a global reduction in the waveform. So there could be various reasons, like I'll be talking about it in the further slides, like hypotension, anesthesia, so many factors. So these are global reasons. So if the upper limb control is good, waveform is good, and the lower limb waveforms have dampened or reduced or they have vanished, that is a serious concern that we need to look at. So that means control is very important. Similarly, if you are doing a right side aneurysm or a carotid endarterectomy, the left side of the brain could be your control. So this also acts as your control. So baseline, alarm criteria, and control. These are basic terminologies that you need to understand. So you can classify intraoperative neuromonitoring based on three types of based on three things. So one is your continuous or intermittent. So there are some free running or continuous signals that keep coming, just like your heart never stops. So there is a continuous ECG coming, or there is a continuous pulse oximetry when you connect to the patient. So similarly, if you record the electrical activity of the brain, that is the cortical gray matter, that is called as EEG. Okay, electroencephalogram. Similarly, the muscles in the body also have some inherent electrical activity running, and this can be recorded, and this is called as electromyography. So these are free running signals. Okay, the other ones are intermittent or stimulated responses. So you can evoke responses by stimulating. So there are various ones. The other way to classify the responses would be mapping and monitoring. So mapping means you are trying to identify the functional structures. So you make stimulation and you create a response and you see which cranial nerve is this, or which part of the brain is this. So that is called as mapping. And then monitoring is continuously monitoring the integrity of the pathways of the of the tissues as and when the surgery is going on. So it's called mapping or monitoring. And also you can classify based on the type of stimulus given. So in somatosensory evoked potentials, what you do is you give electrical current and from the distal peripheral nerves, and then record it at the cortex. So this is called as electrical current response stimulus that you give. So similarly, you can do auditory stimulus for brainstem auditory evoked responses. Okay, where the stimulus is auditory, you give auditory clicks to the ear. Similarly, you can also have visual light stimulating the retina and through goggles, and this can be the responses can be recorded at the occipital cortex. This is called as visual evoked potential. So this is based on the type of stimulus you can classify the intraoperative neuromonitoring modalities. So what we do in today's IONM is, today we follow a multimodal neuromonitoring approach. So we don't only look at, so suppose if you're doing a CP angle, we don't only look at the seventh nerve. We look at all the things that can be monitored around the CP angle. So we can do a fifth nerve monitoring, we can do a lower cranial nerve, we can do brainstem monitoring. So all these together, this is called as multimodal monitoring. So this has improved the outcomes of patients tremendously. So today's era of monitoring is of multimodal neuromonitoring. So now with this brief introduction, let's go on to the each monitoring modality. So I'll be just touching on each monitoring modality. I'll give you a concept and I'll probably tell you where to stimulate, where to record, and how the waveforms look like and where it can be applied. So the first monitoring modality that you need to know is somatosensory evoked potential. So this means nothing but your sensation. Okay. So like if you pinch yourself on your palm. So okay, the impulse is traveling through your peripheral nerves, and then it goes into your spinal cord, and then it is transmitted in the posterior. So okay, this sensation, when you give an electrical stimulus, as in we give in SSEP, this impulse is traveling in the dorsal column. So it's a dorsal column sensation. Okay, so this goes on in the dorsal column, and then rises up, and then in the cervical level, the cervicomedullary level, it decusates, and then it goes up into through the thalamus into the sensory cortex. So that is where we record the responses of SSEP. So SSEP, the stimulation is at the peripheral level in the upper limb. You can stimulate at the median nerve for upper limb. For lower limb, most commonly we use is a posterior tibial nerve. I'll show you where to place the electrodes for that. So these are the stimulators. The recording will be common. It will be in the sensory cortex. So the somatosensory cortex is just behind the central sulcus. Okay, as we all know, in the brain. So we place electrodes in the just behind the central sulcus. Okay. So you can as well record responses if you're stimulating upper limb SSEP. You can also record responses at the brachial plexus level. Okay, this is called Erb's point. You can also record response at the cervical level. You can also record response at the cranial level. Okay, so the latency will differ. So it's simple, right? So if you stimulate in the upper limb and then you record at the brachial plexus, the time taken for this traveling is less. So you get a N9 response. So if in a cervical level, if you measure the latency, it would be probably N13 or something. And then if you record at the cortex, it will be a N20 response. So this is an upper limb SSEP with various recording. Okay. So for SSEP stimulation, we can use sticker electrodes like this, which can be placed on the median nerve. And also we can use needle electrodes also. It's a little invasive. And for recording at the scalp, we use a corkscrew electrode. So these corkscrew electrodes are put into the scalp, and then you have to rotate it, and then it sticks onto the scalp. So it should not come out during the surgery. So we use these kind of corkscrew electrodes. So like I told you, the sensory cortex is behind the central sulcus. Can you see this? This is the central line between the two ears, and this is behind the central sulcus. Okay, so we place the recording electrodes here. So this is a 1020 system of labeling your recording electrodes. You should understand that the left side ones are odd numbered, the right side ones are even numbered. Okay, so it's simple. So this is frontal, this is central, this is parietal, this is occipital. And then the further you go away, the numbers increase. And then the left side you have odd numbers, right side you have even numbers. So C3 will be central, okay, in the central axis, and then it will have a odd number. So it's on the left side. C4 is on the right side, on the center, okay, and CZ is on the Z axis, that is right in the midline. Okay, so this is how we record responses. So C3 dash and C4 dash are used for upper limb SSEP recording. That is, we place them behind the central sulcus. Okay, and C3 is because it is placed on the left side of the scalp, it records responses from the right upper limb. Okay, the C4 dash responses are recorded from the left upper limb. Okay, and then the CZ responses record lower limb SSEPs from both the lower limbs. Okay, so these are the recording electrodes, and this is a reference that we keep. This is a FPZ or an FZ that we use, and also we need to place a ground also. So these are the corkscrew electrodes that you can see, okay, which are attached to the scalp. The connections, I think we'll come back to it. Chaitanya will be explaining it to you again, how we place it and how to measure and all that. So this is just for the introduction part. So these are the electrodes that are placed. So this will be a left-sided one. It should be labeled in odd number, probably a C3. This will be probably a C4, and this will be your FZ. Okay, and this is probably your CZ. So this is how a normal upper limb and a normal lower limb SSEP will look like. So you can see the boxes are numbered variably. So this is a lower limb SSEP. Like I told you, the posterior tibial nerve which you measure, which you stimulate from the ankle, it takes more time for the impulse to travel to the sensory cortex. So the latency is more here. So you get a response after 40 milliseconds. Okay. So each box here is 10 milliseconds. So you can measure 1, 2, 3, 4. So at 40th millisecond, you're getting a response, and this is a positive one. So it's called P40. So this is a normal lower limb SSEP, okay, which is labeled as P40. And then an upper limb SSEP, like I told you, is a N20 after 20 milliseconds. That is, one box is 5, 5, 10, 15, 20. So at the 20th millisecond, you're getting a response, and this is negative. So this is called as N20 response. So here you can see one more thing is there are various waveforms. So what we keep doing is we record a baseline, like I told you. This red one is the baseline, which has been recorded at the initial part of the surgery. And then we continuously keep recording the responses and then comparing the waveforms with the baseline. So what we look for is again the same thing, like I told you, latency and amplitude. So any increase in latency, like the response is coming here somewhere, it's getting late, okay? Or if there is a decrease in amplitude, that is the amplitude size has decreased, okay? The amplitude, that's the amplitudes have become smaller, the responses have become smaller in size. So that is what we look at. So SSEP is the most common alarm criteria that we use is, like I said, 50% decrease in amplitude, 10% increase in latency. Okay, SSEPs can be used from various in various surgeries. So most commonly we use it in spine surgeries. We can also use it in cranial surgeries when we want to look at ischemia. Okay, when we are doing some vascular cases like aneurysm, when we are putting temporary clips on the aneurysm surgeries, we can measure the SSEP and to see whether the ischemia is setting in. Okay. And the advantage of SSEP is that it is a continuous monitor. So you don't need to stop stimulation. You don't need to stop surgery while stimulating. So it can be continuously monitored. So that is an advantage of doing SSEP. So you want monitors which can be continuously monitoring. You don't want to stop. So you keep continuously monitoring. So that's why SSEP is a very good monitoring modality in terms of having continuous monitoring ability. Okay, and it's a very good ischemia monitor. So why it is very good ischemia monitor better than EEG is because EEG is only looking at, EEG is also a very good ischemia monitor, but EEG is only looking at the gray matter at the cortical surface. But the SSEPs look at both the cortical and the subcortical structures. So the SSEP is said to be the best monitor for doing ischemia monitoring. So until now we have understood normal SSEP stimulation and response recording. So now we'll go on to our additive use of SSEP. Here what we do is, so now till now we are recording responses from the scalp by putting corkscrew electrodes. So now suppose if you have done a craniotomy and then you put a strip electrode like this. Okay, this is a strip electrode, a 4-channel or a 8-channel, and you put it perpendicularly across the central sulcus. So suppose you assume that the central sulcus is somewhere going to be here. So you put the strip electrode perpendicularly across it. You can identify the central sulcus by a phenomenon called as phase reversal. This is nothing but continuous SSEP going on, upper limb SSEP, and then wherever you have the central sulcus in between those two electrodes, you'll get a phase reversal. I'll show you what a phase reversal is. So you can see the waveforms here. It's negative. It's negative. Suddenly it's become positive, positive. So in between this negative and positive is your central sulcus. So okay. So you can label it as C4 or C5. So the 4th and 5th, between the 4th and 5th electrode will lie your central sulcus. So this is called as central sulcus mapping by a phenomenon called as phase reversal. So you can use it for central sulcus mapping when you have motor cortex lesion disturbing your central sulcus. You know, when the central sulcus is disturbed and you want to be careful to venture into motor eloquent areas. So this helps you in mapping out your central sulcus. So this is another example. This is a 4-channel electrode placed across the central sulcus. Okay, and then you're trying to identify. You do continuous SSEP upper limb monitoring, and then you can see that the positive has become negative here. So in between these two will be your, probably between the 2 and 3 will be your central sulcus. Okay, so this is how the central sulcus is done. So we have completed SSEP. Now the next monitoring modality is motor evoked potentials. So until now you are monitoring ascending pathways. So you are stimulating peripherally, you are recording at the cortex, okay, and you are looking at ascending responses. Now you are looking the opposite way. So motor evoked potential means you stimulate the cortex, okay, and then you evoke responses at the muscles, okay, distally. So this is a descending response. So what we do is we keep a C3 C4 stimulation, okay, and the motor cortex, as we know, is just anterior to the central sulcus. So we were till now we were placing SSEP recording behind the central sulcus. Now we have to place it just anterior to the central sulcus, and in the same C3 C4 position, once you stimulate through this corkscrew electrodes, the current stimulates the motor strip and the pyramidal cells in the cortex are stimulated, and then the impulses are traveled down in the corticospinal tract. So this corticospinal tract is a single axon. Okay, so you can see from the cell it starts and it continues up to the anterior horn cell. So first synapse is at the anterior horn cell, and then from the anterior horn cell a nerve is born, and then this nerve carries it into the muscle, and through the neuromuscular junction again the signal is transmitted, and then you evoke a response at the muscle. So when we do muscle motor evoked potentials, so what we do is we stimulate at the cortex and we'll evoke a response distally in the muscles. So that is all that we're doing. So we are looking at descending pathway. So you can do a surgery in the motor cortex, somewhere. You can do a brainstem, you can do a thalamic or insular lesion, you can do a cervical spine, you can do a peripheral nerve surgery also. So this MEPs can be used in all these cases. So this is the compound muscle action potential that is recorded in the muscle. So once you record the muscle evoke potential, that is called a compound muscle action potential. Okay. So this is how a normal MEP looks like. Okay. So this basically is the stimulation, and this is a stimulus, and then you get a response like this, and then you look at the amplitude and the latency of these responses. Okay. So again, this is a pictorial representation: stimulation at the pyramidal cell, and then a response. Again, it decusates and then travels to the opposite side, and then the opposite upper limb and the lower limb nerves carry it, and then finally you get a response at the muscle level. So this is called as MEP response. So like I told you, the motor cortex is present in front of the central sulcus. Okay. So again here, this is the central sulcus, this is the motor cortex, this is the sensory cortex. Okay, and this is the homunculus. So this is the motor homunculus. So when we record MEP responses, most commonly we try to place distal recording muscles. So in your upper limb you place adductor pollicis brevis. In the lower limbs also we try to place distal. That is because you can see here that distal muscles are represented very nicely in the motor homunculus. Okay, so you can see that the hand, okay, and the leg, so they are, the distal muscles are more fine activity, so you have more representation in the motor homunculus. So we try to place MEP responses in the distal muscles. So more lateral, this is the medial part, that is a lower limb. If you go more laterally, you have your upper limb, hands, and then more laterally will be your face. So the stimulator here, so here you place corkscrew electrodes at the scalp for stimulation, and you record at the muscle in motor evoked potentials or muscle motor evoked potentials. So this is the C3 C4 again. Like I said, C3 is the left side, C4 is your right side. Okay, and they are placed just anterior to the central sulcus. So once you stimulate in these electrodes, the whole motor strip will get stimulated, and then you record a response at the muscle. This is how it looks like. So the corkscrew electrodes placed on the scalp. Okay, probably in the C3 C4 position here. The left one will be C3, right will be C4. And then these are the recording electrodes from the muscles. So these are needle electrodes which are placed into muscle bellies. So each muscle you need to identify and place it in the muscles. So there is a guide for all that, and I think Chaitanya will be speaking to you about the muzzle placement, so you can see that later. These are the needle electrodes that we use. Okay, once the patient is anesthetized, we place these needle electrodes in the muscles. So this is how it is placed. This is a tibialis anterior. So they are dual needle electrodes. So one acts as a reference and the other acts as a recording. So this is how a tibialis anterior muscle evoked potential recording is placed. So now looking at the waveform. So here, what we basically get is muscle. Once you stimulate, you record the response at the muscle. It's just like your muscle jerking, So it's like a muscle movement. So you get a response like this. And then what we look here is the amplitude. So the amplitude again means the highest peak and the lowest value. Can you see this? This is the amplitude. So for this response, this is the amplitude. This much is the amplitude. Okay, so you can see the amplitude is slightly lower here. Okay, it's not as big as this response. Okay, so in muscle evoked potential, mostly the latencies won't change. It's only the amplitude that changes. So we keep looking at the muscle. So these are the left side electrodes from the muscles, and these are the right side ones. So you can see this is the left hand, left quadriceps, left tibialis anterior, left extensor hallucis longus, and the left foot. So you can see that from the upper limb, the latencies are also slowly increasing. That's because the distance traveled, for the response to evoke a response in the muscles is also slowly increasing. So that's why the latency also, you can see that they're coming later and later as we go distally. These are left ones, these are right ones. This is how a normal MEP waveforms look like. So once you have taken a baseline at the start of surgery, then you continuously do your MEP stimulation and recording and look for amplitude change. So what alarm criteria we look for in MEP response is this. The alarm criteria is threefold. Okay, it's not common. So for each case, it could be different. So sometimes you use a all or none phenomenon. That is, if the response is coming or not. Sometimes you use a alarm criteria like a 50% decrease in amplitude. Sometimes even a higher threshold current required to elicit a response. So more and suppose if you're getting a MEP response at 200, 200 volts, then you probably need to increase the current to evoke a response. That is also a alarm criteria. So these are the alarm criteria that we use in MEP responses. But there are some problems with though muscle MEPs are very specific for monitoring the anterior part of the cord for looking at motor structures or the motor tracts. The problem is that muscle MEPs are intermittent. So it's like you stimulate the cortex. Okay, you say you want to stimulate, so you tell the surgeon, so we are stimulating now. The surgeon has to get off, and then the stimulation happens. Then you record the response at the muscles. So this is intermittent. You cannot do this continuously. So the muscle MEP responses are intermittent. So what happens is if you forget to stimulate during a critical step of surgery, you don't know when you have gone wrong. So if you get a drop in the signal and then you don't know retrospectively when you have gone wrong during the surgery. So that is the disadvantage of doing a MEP. That's why probably it's better to combine a SSEP and MEP, because the SSEP is a continuous monitor and MEP is an intermittent, but the MEP is more specific. The various problems that can occur with MEP monitoring are seizures, tongue bites, and also you should avoid muscle relaxation. We'll discuss all this in the further slides. So like for spine cases, like what I was telling you, if you want to monitor the spine completely, you need to do both SSEP and MEP, because the SSEP is looking at the posterior part, that is the dorsal column, and the anterior part of the cord is monitored by the motor muscle evoked potential. So you should combine SSEP and MEP together. But most of us have started doing, we are more fond of doing MEPs than SSEPs, but doing SSEP can add more sensitivity also to the intraoperative neuromonitoring. You can see that the vascular supply is also different. So if you're looking at the spinal cord, the posterior dorsal column is supplied differently and the anterior part is supplied differently. So they are actually two different entities. So you need to probably monitor both SSEP and MEP to get a good spine intraoperative neuromonitoring. Initially, when spine monitoring was started, so SSEP was the only thing which was done. So they started doing only SSEP and assuming that when you do SSEP, the whole spinal cord is being monitored. But problem was there were a lot of false negative. That means the SSEP waveforms remained intact after surgery, but the patients woke up with motor deficits. That is because the SSEP is not at all looking at the motor tracts. If you want to do motor tract monitoring, you should do MEP monitoring. So then slowly MEP started coming up, and then now we do SSEP and MEP combined for uh, spine surgeries. Okay. So like MEP responses, like I've already told you, you can do it in all your spine cases. So this is a cervical spine, probably like tight spinal cord, cervical spine surgery where you are worried about the cord, and also like a AAD. So, in AAD probably even positioning also becomes important. So when you want to position patients, you can do pre-positioning MEP and then position the patient and then look at post-positioning MEP, and this can also help you during your positioning, also during your instrumentation and your manipulation. So in a cervical spine case, what we would like to do is SSEP and MEP together. So that is what we have done in this case. This is how our responses look like. So now we'll go on to motor cortex mapping. That is, this is an additional thing for MEP. So now, until now, we were stimulating in the motor, motor cortex through corkscrew electrodes and recording responses at the muscles. So now what we are doing is we are directly exposing the brain after craniotomy, and then we are stimulating through stimulators. Okay, and then we map out the structures. That is called as motor cortex mapping. So this is how it is done. This is the stimulator. Once you stimulate the brain, whichever part of the motor, it's like a hand area, face area, or leg area, you can stimulate and record responses at those sites and mark them as mapped out functional motor tissues. So this is how a response looks like. Because you're stimulating only one part of the brain on one side, you'll only get one-sided responses. So if you're doing a right side stimulation, you'll get a left-sided response in only the areas that you are stimulating. So you might not get a whole response. You might only get hand area or face area. So that's how you map out the motor cortex. So these are the various stimulators used: bipolar, monopolar. Okay. So to briefly tell you the difference between monopolar and bipolar stimulation is very, very specific. It's like a bipolar cautery. So the current stays in between the two, prongs of your bipolar stimulation. So if you want to do localized stimulation, like you want to do cranial nerve monitoring, you should probably use a bipolar stimulator. When you are seeing the nerve and you want to stimulate the nerve and evoke a response. Monopolar you use when you're searching for something. So this gives you a diffuse current. So this monopolar stimulator is used for such stimulation. So these are the stimulators that we use. You can also do, like I said, the cortical mapping and mapping out the functional tissues, functional areas in the motor, eloquent motor areas. You can also do subcortical mapping. So this is one advanced thing that has come up. So what we do is we keep stimulating as and when you do go deep into the tumor, and how far you are from the functional tracts you can identify. Okay. So suppose you get a positive stimulation at, so the dictum is 1 milliampere stimulation is equal to 1 millimeter distance. 1 milliampere stimulation is equal to 1 millimeter distance for subcortical mapping. Okay. So if you have the motor functional tracts, okay, or the subcortical tracts at a 7 millimeter distance, you will get a positive response at 7 milliampere, okay, or higher. Okay, so then you can identify how far you are from the subcortical structures. So this is a subcortical mapping. This is very useful. This is recently come up, and this is a suction monopolar stimulator. Okay, so what this is the surgeon continuously uses it like a suction device. He doesn't need to use a separate stimulator, and also there is a tip which has a stimulator. Okay, so and this is the connection of the wire. You can see this. So as and when continuously he is doing deep tumor work, you can keep using it as a suction, and also the stimulation is going on. And you can tell him, when you get a response like this, you can tell him how far you are from the functional tract. So probably we stop at our institute, we stop at around 5 to 7 millimeter distance, or 5 to 7 positive milliampere stimulation. We don't go beyond this because it's very thin and you don't know when you can injure the subcortical tracts. So briefly, this is the algorithm for eloquent motor cortex tumor. So when you have a motor cortex tumor or a motor area tumor, you can do it either in awake or in a general anesthesia. So under the awake situation, you first need to map out. So very important to map out the tissues first, map out the functional areas, because that will give you an edge. So you already know that this is a functional area, and then you need to be more careful in that area. So the mapping is very important. Once you map out the structures with stimulation, then you do your continuous monitoring and do your tumor resection, and then you can stop whenever you encounter a deficit, or you stop at the subcortical level, like 5 to 7 milliampere positive stimulation. That's what I told you. So this is for awake. So when you do a general and motor cortex lesion, you can do under general anesthesia also. So here what we do is initially do a central sulcus mapping. You identify the motor cortex, and then you map out the structures. Okay, once you do your mapping out, then you do your continuous resection with direct cortical stimulation. So here what we do is the same strip electrode we keep on the motor cortex and keep doing a continuous MEP response, and then you look for responses. So as and when the the stimulation, the recorded MEPs amplitude and amplitudes have decreased, you can stop the surgery, or you can do continuous resection until the subcortical mapping shows a 5 to 7 milliampere positive stimulation. So this is how you do a eloquent motor cortex tumor. This is awake and under general anesthesia. So you can use stimulation also for your speech area mapping. So you can identify the speech structures which are involved in a patient. So you can identify the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area also. So you like you continuously for speech you have to do it awake. So there is no other option. You need to keep the patient talking, and then you stimulate the structures of the brain, and then you look for speech arrest. So whenever you get a speech arrest, that is the Broca's area involved, and the patient immediately stops talking. So I'll show it in a video. And for Wernicke's area, you have some naming objects which you have accustomed the patient preoperatively. You have shown some objects and you ask the patient continuously to name the objects intraoperatively when the patient is being stimulated by the surgeon. So you can identify the speech structures and also map out the speech areas. So this is an example of a speech area. So you can see this is the functional MRI of the patient, frontal tumor. We were very worried about this patient because the fMRI was showing there was a lightening up inside the tumor. So we were very worried about the speech of this patient. So these kind of tumors are very useful when you do mapping and continuous monitoring. So we chose to do an awake craniotomy. We also did speech mapping for speech arrest and also did motor mapping. So these are the small glove papers that we use. We label them with S for speech, H for hand, L for leg, F for face. So you can label and then you can place it on the cortex, which are the functionally mapped structures. This is a small video to show how we do awake craniotomies at our center. So we follow a scalp block technique, and then once the patient, we follow an asleep cycle. So we first put the patient asleep and then awaken him during the monitoring phase. It's important to map out the structures and then do monitoring. So like I told you, if you don't map the structures and do only clinical monitoring, if you do a awake craniotomy, just asking the patient to move and talk, you'll encounter a deficit after the deficit has happened. So it's important to map out the area. So this is a motor mapping going on. So once the stimulation is going on, you can evoke a responses at the different muscle groups, and then you can label it. So this is a leg stimulation. Okay, you can see the leg area being stimulated. This is a face. You can see the jaw. This is the face area mapping, or the jaw area. This is the surgeon using the continuous stimulation and mapping out the area. So this is how we have labeled. S is speech, H is hand, L is leg. So these are the mapped functional areas on the brain. Once you have mapped out the motor areas, you can do continuous monitoring. You can ask the patient to continuously, the surgeon continues his resection and the patient continuously moves his upper limb, lower limb, and continuously does it. As soon as you encounter some kind of weakness, you immediately probably need to stop and decide what to do then. So that is how we do our motor area tumors. For speech mapping, so this is how I'll show you. I don't know if you can hear this. So she's actually counting in the mother tongue. So you should use mother tongue here because the mother tongue is the most, initially mapped out language. So this is a speech arrest. So she was counting 1, 2, 3, 4, she stopped at that number. So that is a motor speech arrest for the Broca's area. So I'm asking her something and she's not able to, she's able to vocabulate, but she's not able to tell me exactly. I'm asking her name, she's telling her place name. So that is probably a naming difficulty or a comprehension difficulty. Yeah, so when I prompt her, she's able to tell. So here a number counting is going on. And these are the objects which have been shown preoperatively to the patient, and the patient is identifying it as the tumor resection is going on. She's doing it in her mother tongue. Here she is a Bengali patient, so she's labeling it in the mother tongue, in the Bengali language. Okay, I think we'll move. All right. So this is how we do an awake case. So again, for speech, you have to first map out the motor, sensory, and you can also ask the patient to repeat to map out the adequate fasciculus. And once you have mapped out, do continuous clinical monitoring and look for any deficit. So now we have completed SICP, MEP, also mapping during direct cortical stimulation. Now we'll move on to the next monitoring modality, which is electromyography. So EMG is nothing but the electrical activity which is recorded from the muscles. So here you can do free running EMG, that is continuous electrical activity of the muscles. This is called as raw EMG or free running EMG. Or you can do triggered EMG by stimulating a nerve and evoking a response at the muscle. Okay, this is called as triggered EMG. Okay, so you can evoke responses or you can see free running EMG from the cranial nerve distributed muscles, like your muscles of the face, muscles supplied by the facial nerve. Okay, so muscles supplied by the fifth nerve, so various cranial nerve EMGs. Also, you can do spinal nerve EMG. So suppose you are doing a anal sphincter monitoring for a tethered cord, or for a lipomyeningomyelocele, so spinal dysraphism. So you can do your free running and triggered EMG for your spinal nerves also. So remember that in electromyography or in EMG, you cannot monitor the spinal cord integrity. What you're monitoring is the nerve root. So if you want to do spinal cord monitoring, you have to do SSCP MEP. If you want to do nerve root monitoring, you have to do EMG. Okay. So the EMG is very beneficial because it gives loud signals. It has, the nerve irritation can be identified if you go near the nerve. So these are the various uses of EMG. So the amplitudes are very big, the responses. You can have audio feedback. I'll show you in the future slides. And also it is, if you do only triggered EMG or stimulated EMG, you can use muscle relaxant, but it's always beneficial to do raw EMG also. So you need to stop muscle relaxant to monitor the raw EMG. So that's why we advise not to give muscle relaxant when you're doing EMG monitoring also. So the various cranial nerves that muscles that we use to monitor cranial nerves. So for fifth nerve, we use a masseter and we use temporalis. Okay. So the masseter is in the angle of the mouth and the temporalis is in the temporal, hollow or the temporal window here. And then for seventh nerve, that is the facial nerve, we use orbicularis oculi, orbicularis oris, and mentalis. These are the most common muscles used for facial nerve. Also, you can do 3, 4, 6 monitoring around the eyeball. Okay, this is little challenging, but with experience, you can do this. So we place in the medial rectus, lateral rectus, and in the superior part. This is for your superior oblique. So 3, 4, 6 cranial nerve monitoring you can do for your extraocular muscles for your 3, 4, 6 cranial nerves. Also 9, 10, 12 you can do 10th for 9th and 12th. 9th we place in the soft palate, okay, the electrodes, and 12th we put on the tongue. Okay, this is a hypoglossal nerve monitor. And for 10th, you can either place it invasively when you do your laryngoscopy. You can ask your anesthetist to place around the vocal cord, but this is little invasive. So the best option for that would be to have an endotracheal tube. Okay, so I'll show you that. So we have an endotracheal tube which is incorporated with a sensor for 10th nerve monitoring. So this is how a raw EMG looks like. So this raw EMG is very important. I told you it's always important to do raw EMG along with triggered EMG when you do cranial nerve monitoring because you can identify irritation. So suppose you're operating around the cranial nerve and you want to identify the cranial nerve even before the surgeon has seen it. So you can tell the surgeon that you're probably near the cranial nerve. You're probably doing a CUSA or a drilling. You can get intermittent short bursts like this, or it can be continuous, so like a popcorn. So this is a continuous listening when you have direct nerve compression. So when you're actually absolutely on the nerve, or you're causing direct traction on the nerve or direct ischemia on the nerve. So this has to have an audio feedback also. This is a surgery where a surgeon was operating, our surgeon was operating on the cranial, this was I think a CP angle tumor, and I got irritative signals you can see on the facial nerve here, and you can see that even before the cranial nerve, the surgeon could see, we could tell him that you're probably near the cranial nerve, fifth cranial nerve, and you should be careful. And then when he saw down, he could see the cranial nerve right there. So the raw EMG helps you to tell the surgeon even before he sees it that you're probably going near a cranial nerve. Very important in CP angle and brainstem cases. This is a continuous neurotonic trend. So here the nerve was directly probably irritated. So you can see a continuous, you can probably hear the audio feedback also. There's a continuous motor bomb, like, ton, 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 ton. That is a kind of sound that it creates. So when the nerve is left alone, it becomes intermittent. You can see it's slowly becoming intermittent. These are short bursts when the nerve is less irritated. So it's very important to have audio feedback also for these cranial nerve raw EMG monitoring. Okay, so these are intermittent now. So when the nerve was left alone, it became intermittent. This is a triggered EMG using a stimulator. You can see the stimulation is evoking a response here. Okay, you can evoke responses at various cranial nerve innervated muscles. This is a 10th nerve monitoring that I was talking about. So this is an endotracheal tube which has a sensor here. So this sensor is placed between the vocal cords here. So every time you stimulate the 10th nerve, this vocal cord twitches and this response can be recorded on the screen here like this. This is a 10th nerve monitoring endotracheal tube. So all the cranial nerves can be monitored except the olfactory nerve. We can do all other cranial nerve monitoring using EMGs. For optic nerve, we have visual potentials. I'll talk to you about this next. So this is a typical example of a CP angle lesion, big one, and going into the brainstem, going into it's a big one. So this probably in these kind of cases we use what all do we monitor? So we monitor raw EMG and triggered EMG of fifth nerve, seventh nerve, and also the cranial nerves. We do continuous monitoring of the raw EMG and also stimulation based monitoring of the cranial nerves. Also, we use SSCP MEP for brainstem monitoring. Okay, and also we can use BERA for auditory evoked potentials for your brainstem integrity monitoring. So we have covered most of the important aspects of monitoring. Now I'll briefly rush through the other ones which are important so that you understand the other monitoring modalities as well. So there's an anal sphincter monitoring, which is used, when you're doing your tethered cords or your spinal dysraphism, you can place electrodes in the anal sphincter and then record responses by stimulation. This is a lipomyeningomyelocele where you have a neural placode. So here it's important to stimulate and do continuous and triggered EMG to identify the sacral nerve roots and evoke responses. Okay. So this is how we do triggered EMG of the anal sphincter. These are anal sphincter evoked responses. Also, apart from the surgical stimulation, we also use a transcranial stimulation also. So we use transcranial corkscrew electrodes to stimulate the motor cortex, and then we evoke responses even from the anal sphincter. You can do transcranial MEP recording from the anal sphincter also. This is important to do continuously because it gives a continuous feedback. Even before the surgeon, even the surgeon doesn't stimulate, you can continuously monitor by your transcranial stimulation. So transcranial MEP and SSCP for your sciatic. This is a posterior tibial nerve. You can do for your sciatic nerve distribution also for your sciatic or your sacral nerve, SSCPs. This is a tethered cord. I have a small clip to show you. Okay. So here, the important thing is you need to identify the nervous and the non-nervous phylum. So you can see the phylum when it is stimulated, we don't get any response here. But as soon as you touch the other nervous tissue, you are getting a positive response. This is a bipolar stimulator. So we can identify the phylum for tethered cords also. You can see the anal sphincter stimulation here. We always keep an audio feedback for the surgeon also. You can use triggered EMG for pedicle screw monitoring also. So whenever you place pedicle screws, if there is a medial cortical breach of the pedicle screw, you can directly stimulate the screw here and evoke responses from the corresponding nerve root. So if you get evoke responses below 6 milliampere stimulation, that is probably a bad screw. And 6 to 10 milliamperes if you're getting a stimulation, that means it is somewhere in between. It's like intermediate. And above 10 or 12, if you're using a stimulation on the screw and you're not getting a nerve root stimulation, that means it's a good screw. So you can use it for your pedicle screw testing also. So here we stimulate the pedicle screw, okay, directly through your monopolar stimulator. So these are the various muscles that you need to monitor for your nerve root monitoring. You need to know this, and you need to probably have a chart in your OT. So for which nerve root you need to, unless you put that muscle nerve root, you will not be able to monitor that nerve root well. Visual evoked potentials is difficult to do intraoperatively because anesthesia, it's very sensitive to anesthesia, and but we have been successfully doing it in our cases, in few of our cases. So we have done around 10 cases now where we have used visual evoked potentials. We use eye goggles for stimulation, and the recording here is from the occipital electrode. So these are the eye goggles with LED lights which are stimulated, and this is one of the case where you are using a skull-based tumor, and this is the optic nerve you can identify here. So we were worried about the visual, optic nerve injury. So we were doing continuous VEP monitoring, okay, with eye goggles, and we were evoking a response. So here the response that we get is a P100 response, okay, the 100 millisecond response. So here similarly we look for have a baseline, and then we continuously look for latency amplitude of this P100 response. So it's very difficult to do VEP monitoring. There are concerns about anesthetic sensitivity, also laterality. Even if you stimulate one eye, if you want to monitor one nerve, optic nerve left side, you get responses from both eyes. So that is one more drawback. And the third thing is even the goggles also can slip out during surgery. So what we do is we do electroretinography. So here what we do is we record responses from the retina here, and this helps us to identify whether the responses are dampening because of actually because of the surgical part, or because the goggles have slipped out during surgery. Many times the goggles slip down during surgery and we lose evoked responses. So that's why we have started doing ERG also. This is electroretinography. Again, the next one is brainstem auditory responses. Here you stimulate in the ear through auditory clicks. Here you have earplugs, and then we evoke responses at the auditory cortex, either from the mastoid area, that is called M1 or M2, from right or left, and then A1 or A2. So we can evoke responses. There are 7 waves that you get during evoke responses of the brainstem auditory. These are called BERA, or brainstem auditory evoke responses. So this is the brainstem. This is the most commonly what we look at is the 4th and 5th complex. This is the highest or the most prominent one. We look for amplitude and latency again of this waveform, comparing it with the baseline. So this is mostly used in brainstem surgeries, in microvascular decompressions, these kind of brainstem lesions. So even if you have a CP angle with an auditory deficit on one side, sensory neural hearing loss on one side, you can still do opposite stimulation and then record for the brainstem integrity. So these are the earplugs that we use for stimulation for auditory evoke responses. Some points on anesthesia. I'm not going into detail about anesthetic management. So most important thing is you should understand which monitoring modality is applied and what is your anesthetic titration. If you're using MEPs or triggered EMG, you should probably stop muscle relaxant. Inhalation agents are probably not good because they cause a lot of amplitude reduction and latency increase. And visual evoke potentials are the most sensitive, and then MEP and SSEP are also sensitive to various kinds of anesthetic agents. BERA is one thing that is resistant to all anesthetic agents. So whatever anesthesia you use, BERA will come. So that is one advantage of using BERA. The one take-home message I'll want to give is in anesthesia is you should use a steady state anesthetic technique, probably a TIVA, and you should not give any boluses. So it's very difficult to do anesthesia for evoke potential monitoring. At our center, what we use is we commonly use total intravenous anesthesia, zero MAC, that is no inhalations, no nitrous oxide. We use propofol with target control infusion pumps, and we target it to an entropy or a EEG or a BIS monitor. We also sometimes add dexmedetomidine infusions to maintain hemodynamic stability. It has very little effect on evoke potential recording, so this is one good agent that you can use. Opioids you can use freely for analgesia, so opioid infusions like fentanyl, morphine can be used. So these are the various things that can affect intraoperative neuromonitoring signals. So some of the things that can affect intraoperative neuromonitoring are hypothermia. Okay, suppose you're doing a long surgery and you lose responses, you should look at the temperature. Then BP, so hypotension also can dampen the waveforms. Anesthetic agents, so suppose somebody has come in and then your anesthetist has given a bolus, that can also, you should look at your anesthetic dosing. You can look at trainer for your muscle relaxant depth when you're not getting MEP response. Also, you can look at technical factors. Suppose there is a disconnection, noise in the OT, various technical things like OT table, warmer, neuronavigation, all electrical equipment can cause noise for the signals. Finally, will be a surgical factor. So once all these things have ruled out, then you need to tell the surgeon, probably this is because of a surgical induced, signal dampening, and you need to look at what needs to be done. So for checklist, we have an institute-based checklist. Each time we get a signal change, we follow this. One is hemodynamic, next is metabolic, then we look at anesthetic factors, then we look at technical factors, and then finally we tell the surgeon that probably this could be a surgical injury and we need to look at the surgery. So once the neuromonitoring signals have dampened and you have done your checklist, so then each person has his role. So the surgeon has to undo his previous step of manipulation. He has to remove his retraction. So those are he can use warm saline for irrigation. He can use papaverine for, for vasodilation. The anesthetist has his own role. He has to take care of the BP, temperature, at the dosing and, all the other hemodynamic parameters. The neurophysiologist also has his role. He has to try to get repeated stimulation and to try to elicit whether this is a real dampening of the waveform. Also, the OT technician has his role also, that he needs to look at the noise reduction and electrical interference. Once all these things have been done, if you still have a response which is still low, or you have got a diminution in the amplitude of the response, then you can look at other things like administering steroids, and then you need to take a decision whether you need to stop the surgery, you need to wake up the patient. That is a surgical decision that you would need to take at a case-to-case basis. So the various responses that they are labeled as true, positive, all this. So what advantage that neuromonitoring has is we have very less, false negative response. That is, we rarely encounter cases where there is no change in signals, but you have a patient with a deficit. If you are doing monitoring correctly, the false negative rate is absolutely going to be near zero. But there is going to be a lot of false positives. So you might get false alarms. So initially, when your team is doing your monitoring, they might give you, I've given many false alarms to my surgeons. but you don't know initially when you start doing monitoring which is a true alarm, which is a false alarm. So initially you'll encounter a lot of false positive. One example for false negative is in your tumor. When we do in your motor area, in your anterior part of the motor area, there is no signal change interoperatively in MEP recording. We found this in one of few of our cases, but there was post-op deficit in the patients when the patient woke up. So when we saw this reversed slowly, the deficits reversed slowly, and this is probably because of SMA syndrome, supplementary motor area. So these tumors have tendency to cause transient deficits, which cannot be picked up on intraoperative monitoring signals intraoperatively. So if you're doing tumors anterior to the motor cortex, you should have the thing that you can have SMA syndrome and false negative signals. That is, the patient can wake up with a deficit without even MEP signal dampening. EEG, I'll not go into detail. EEG, you can use it for vascular monitoring, for ischemia monitoring, okay, for giving neuroprotection in your aneurysm surgery while causing burst suppression. Also for electrocorticography, you can use in epilepsy surgeries to see how much percentage change in epileptiform activity has been seen. So this is how we do your EEG. So this is the electrocorticography. This is a electrocorticography grid that you have applied on the scalp, and then you look for EEG for epileptiform reduction. So this is one of the recent advances that we have in our. So what this is called as D-Wave, or direct epidural MEP monitoring. So here what happens is you have an epidural catheter with a sensor which is placed by the surgeon himself in the epidural space, and then you get responses like this. So basically what you are doing here is we are not recording MEP responses from the muscles, we are recording at the epidural level only. Okay, so that is how epidural MEP or D-Wave monitoring is done. So here you can see, like I told you, the corticospinal tract is one single axon. So if you record epidurally the responses, this is called as epidural MEP or your D-Wave monitoring. So the concept is, why monitor distally at the muscles when there are so many synapses involved? Because each synapse can cause delay in synaptic transmission because of various structures, like I told you, temperature, anesthesia, all this. So when you want to avoid all this synaptic transmission, you can directly do a epidural MEP recording distally at the level of surgery. Suppose you are doing a surgery in your cervical level, you can put it at the lower level of your incision, the epidural catheter, and record the response. This is called as D-Wave. This is gold standard for your spinal cord tumor, like intramedullary tumor monitoring. Similar for this, same corpus electrodes that you use for stimulation of MEP can be used, and you can do this continuously. So the advantage of D-Wave is you can do it continuously. You don't need to stop muscle relaxant, and it's very specific for your intramedullary tumors. So even if you have a MEP drop in the muscles and still you have a D-Wave intact of more than 50%, you can continue to do your spinal cord intramedullary tumor resection until the D-Wave amplitudes drop by 50%. So this is how a surgically it's placed. I have a small video to show. So this is how the incision, this is the proximal part or the cranial part. So we are putting it at the distal part, because whatever the surgery is done, it will hamper the distal transmission of the D-Wave impulse. So the epidural catheter is placed either subdurally or epidurally by the surgeon himself. And then we get responses like this. You can see the D-Wave here. We keep looking at the amplitude of this. That is amplitude reduction. Whether it is more than 50%, we keep looking. This is called as D-Wave. Okay. So for D-Wave monitoring, like I told you, the alarm criteria is 50% decrease in amplitude. The one disadvantage of D-Wave monitoring, it has no laterality. So it doesn't have lateral information. Like in MEPs, you can say left side MEP response, right side MEP response. For D-Wave, it will basically looks at the spinal cord, corticospinal tract's whole structure. So there is no lateral information in D-Wave. So other issues with monitoring is you need to place bite blocks. So because tongue lacerations can be seen, we have had cases with severe tongue lacerations, especially in prone and lateral position when the tongue tends to hang out during our MEP monitoring. So we place bite blocks like this, or soft structures, or things like that, silicone bite blocks like this, which we have placed in this patient to protect the tongue, and then the tongue is kept in the center, and these are bite blocks. Seizures also are an important thing. We need to we can avoid seizures by using minimal stimulation and the correct amount of stimulation. And also, whenever you encounter a seizure, you need to keep cold saline ready, and you need to just pour cold saline immediately on the cortex, and this can stop the seizure. So these are the bite blocks, silicone bite blocks that we have in our institute. So just to complete the presentation, few advanced modalities. So now what we are going into is we want to do more of continuous monitoring. So if you're doing your spinal dysraphism or lipomeningomyelocele, we want monitoring modalities which can be continuously monitored. So bulbocavernous reflex is one such monitoring modality where you stimulate from the for boys you use the penis, or for the ladies you use the clitoris, and then you need to keep stimulator there, and then you record responses from the anal sphincter. So this is a bulbocavernous reflex that can be used as a continuous monitor. Okay. The corticobulbar MEP. So these are also something which can be used in your cranial nerve monitoring. So suppose facial nerve or CP angle when you're doing, you only ask the surgeon to stimulate and then evoke a response. Sometimes the surgeon might not stimulate and evoke a response. So you want a continuous monitoring to be happening. So here what we do is we use a corticobulbar MEP. So this is a continuous monitoring which can be used in these kind of cases where you put muscles in your bulbar. So this is your lower cranial nerve, seventh nerve. You can do continuous monitoring. There's one more modality which has recently come up for your seventh nerve and fifth nerve monitoring. This is called as blink reflex. We stimulate from the fifth nerve and record responses from the seventh nerve, and this has a continuous feedback for your fifth and seventh nerve integrity. So these are all advanced modalities. It's not, I mean, you need to get more and more accustomed to this. This is our team from Yashoda Hospitals. These are the surgeons that I work with, and these are the anesthetists and the technicians whom I work with. So our journey was initially when we started doing monitoring, we didn't have a neurophysiologist, we didn't have a technician, so we had to train ourselves. So initially we started with simpler monitoring modalities like SSEP, MEP, and then initially we used to take a lot of time to put these electrodes, but now over time we have got used to it. So we have two anesthetists in the OT, one takes care of the monitoring for the connections, and the technicians are also well trained, so they do it pretty quickly. The other anesthetist looks at the anesthesia part. So it's got smoother. So the journey will get smoother. Initially you'll have a lot of hurdles and challenges, but the journey will get smoother. That's what I can say from my experience of doing intraoperative monitoring for the past 4 years. This is our intraoperative neuromonitoring society that we have. There's no society as such. This is the International Society of Intraoperative Neuromonitoring from WFNS, that is the World Federation of Neurosurgeons. So every year we have a users meet. So all the people who are doing intraoperative neuromonitoring, we meet at a platform. We discuss cases and we interact with each other and learn from each other as to what we are doing differently and how we learn from each other. This is Professor Vedran Delitis. If you can Google intraoperative neuromonitoring, the first name that you'll probably get is this man. He's the master of intraoperative monitoring, and every year he comes to India to train us, to educate us, to interact with us. And so last meeting was considered in Hyderabad in our institute. The next one is I don't know when it's going to happen, but it's scheduled to happen in Chennai. It's a good platform for learning where all the people who are doing neuromonitoring interact with each other. Also, one more thing is we have recently written a textbook chapter in this Atlas on Neuro-Oncology, which is being done by SGPGI, Dr. Professor Sanjay Bihari. So we have written a nice chapter on neuro-oncological cases and approach for intraoperative neuromonitoring, where various tumors and various cases have been discussed, and the approach for those tumors have been discussed. Thank you for your patient listening. Chaitanya?
Hello. Yes, sir. Thank you for a very exhaustive session, and that was like a marathon. But it was very interesting that you have shown all the monitoring modalities from basic to the most advanced. So thank you for that. There are some questions I think which you have answered already, but some are there. Maybe I'll just read them out. Maybe you can answer them. So what is the threshold for speech mapping in your experience?
Threshold, you mean how much more you can go?
How much current or current threshold?
So initially the same thing, you start at low currents. So we started probably around 1, 2, and then keep going up. So whenever you encounter the speech area at the lowest current, that is your threshold. So that's how we need to go from lower to higher, and then you stop at the current whichever you're eliciting a response. That is your threshold. And rarely we go above 15 or 20 milliamperes. So that's probably the maximum. Probably 15, I would say 15 or 20.
Yeah, so 15. Yeah, correct. So there is one more question. I think, what is the alarm criteria in raw EMG that you look for?
So the raw EMG is continuous monitoring. You look for irritative signals. Like I told you, you can get continuous irritative signals when you are directly around the nerve, or you're doing distal work like your CUSA or your irrigation around the nerve also, you can get intermittent signal. There will be a lot of artifacts in this. So here you'll get a lot of false positive alarms. You'll get a lot of artifacts. You'll get a lot of movement artifacts when the surgeon is touching. So you need to keep closely monitoring the surgeon's actions also. So what we do in our center is we have a surgical video that is played to us also for the anesthetist and the neurophysiology team. And we keep looking at the surgeon also. Whenever he is operating, if there is a response, then we alarm the surgeon. So it's important to see the surgical field also. Raw EMG, a lot of artifacts, a lot of this thing, but like I told you, if you have a continuous irritation, you are very close to the nerve. If you're getting continuous disrupted or short bursts, but you're getting it, frequently, and it's like there when the surgeon is operating around that field, that is when you probably look at the, you can call it an alarm.
I think you have shown it in the video also, so
Yeah,
that I
the
think that
video
answers
was,
the question. Does anesthesia affect VEP? I think you have covered that. I think VEP
Yeah.
is the most affected by
Yes.
anesthesia.
Yeah.
Dr. Anil Parak, what levels of BIS entropy for the neuro monitoring? Dr. Nitin, you have vast
Yeah.
experience of doing monitoring.
Yeah.
What is your BP target for EMG and SSCP?
Okay, so the BIS monitoring for our center, we follow the normal 40 to 60 doesn't hold good for monitoring. We want to keep it a little lower just to make sure that the patient is adequately under. So we try to keep it around 30 to 45. That is probably our target for doing intraoperative neuromonitoring, the BIS values. And what was the second question? SACP, something you said.
SSCP and EMG, what is the value of BIS that you maintain?
Yeah, the same thing. So we try to target 30 to 40, 45 range of BIS or entropy. Sometimes even the BIS and entropy can come off. So that is a real challenge. Then what do you do with your TIVA? How do you titrate it? So we use SEF, that is spectral edge frequency. That is EEG also can be, spectralized, and you can get a number. And this SEF into 3 will probably be equal to your entropy or BIS. So you can ask a neurophysiologist to explain to you, and you can, whenever you lose your BIS or entropy also, sometimes it comes out during craniotomy. So you can use this EEG to give the same cortical electrodes that you have used for recording your SSCP can be used for EEG also, and you can use it for continuous monitoring for your depth also.
Thank you, sir. I think Dr. Dheeraj also answered that on the chart. So thank you to Dr. Dheeraj. Sir, where we have to stimulate for blink reflex? I think you have mentioned that.
Yeah, so it's not something which we have actually mastered. This is something which Professor Vedran Delitis has been talking to us, and he's been encouraging us to do. So anything around the fifth nerve. So we use, whatever needles you have used for your fifth nerve monitoring, the same temporalis or masseter, you can use it for stimulation and then record from the orbicularis oculi. So this is the reflex that we look at. We have done it for very few cases in our center, but we are aiming to do more and more of this because it is more continuous. So we want something which is continuous monitoring. So that is the advantage of doing blink reflex. Probably with more experience, I can talk to you more about that. But currently, it's at the preliminary stage.
Okay, I think that's it, sir. Yeah, onset of seizure interop indicated by BIS.
Onset of seizure. So for seizures, what we do is like I told you, we use a minimal current, and then you can do also EEG monitoring, like your after discharge monitoring. When you are doing simulation from the distal side, you can do after discharge monitoring to reduce or to identify early seizures. Okay, and then like I told you, keep cold saline ready, prophylactic anticonvulsants. So seizures are a part of monitoring. You don't need to get afraid with seizures, because actually what you're doing by doing MEP monitoring is actually like you're inducing seizures. So you are giving a current on the brain and then evoking a response. So whenever you get a seizure, treat it with cold saline, and then you can stop for some time, and then you can go back to monitoring. So there is you will encounter more and more seizures as you do more and more of intraoperative monitoring, and the fear factor also will come down.
Okay. And the last question, sir. So just what kind of neuromonitoring can we do or use for patients on CPB?
CPB for cardiac?
Yeah,
cardiopulmonary bypass, I think. So yeah, okay. So we have tried it in our cardiac cases for one of the thoracic abdominal aneurysms for lower limb paraplegia monitoring. The problem in CPB or cardiopulmonary bypass is the severe hypothermia that is created. So they use hypothermia, and you basically what you look at is your lower limb SSCP and MEP waveforms. for your lower limb paraplegia monitoring. But the hypothermia will increase the latency of these waveforms tremendously. So sometimes we were shocked to see how late the responses were coming. So I don't have much experience with this, but one case I will show you in my cases when we talk about it next. So where we have used it in the neurocath lab also for lower limb paraplegia. SSAP MEP is what you need to look at, but a lot of challenges when you do it for cardiac cases.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you for patiently answering all the questions.
I think Dr. Rajesh is ready.
Yeah, Dr. Rajesh is there on the call. So, so I would request you to stop sharing the presentation and
Okay.
yeah. So while